Time for us to move on to some really exciting stuff. And I say that it's exciting, well, because it involves different kinds of foods to that rapid fat loss meal template that we've been working with for the last few weeks. So this is all about what is GI and what is GL and all these kinds of things that revolve around this. Now, if you've never heard of GI or GL, that's totally fine, because I'm going to cover what it is. And I'm not going to go on and on about it. I'm, hopefully not going to bore you. But what I'm going to do is go through it so you've got a really good understanding of how it works and what it's all about. Now, GI stands for glycemic index. And that comes from some research that was done quite a while ago now, at least a couple of decades ago, where they actually realized that different kinds of foods had a different impact on your blood sugar levels. And so hence the phrase glycemic, meaning sugar, index. So what they did was they actually tested all of these different kinds of foods, and the testing still goes on today. In fact, a lot of food manufacturers in certain parts of the world will actually have their particular food products tested so that they get a number, a glycemic index number, that they can then advertise to tell people what kind of impact their food actually has on someone's blood sugar. Now, this is obviously a pretty good gauge of how much insulin, for example, someone's going to release. It's not an exact measurement. There's not always a direct connection between your blood sugar level and how much insulin you release. And there's always a few foods that tend to be a little bit unusual, I guess, in terms of the response that your body has. But in general terms, the glycemic index is quite a good measurement, and it's a good way of understanding what kinds of things you can eat without affecting your blood sugar too much, and also, on the flip side, what kinds of foods really affect your blood sugar in a big way. So that index scale, generally it goes from 0 up to around 130, thereabouts. Now, white bread, a piece of white bread, is given the number 100. And so that gives you kind of a good idea, because we understand that white bread is digested very, very quickly. I think, for example, ice cream is also around 100. Now, a lot of fruit might be around 60, something like that there. A lot of whole grain products tend to hover around maybe 60 up to 80, something like that. Different kinds of rice hover between 45 and all the way up to 100 in some cases. And then you start getting into the lower GI foods. Now, low GI is designated as below 55, so it's quite a large range. And I'm giving you these numbers because you might decide to Google this stuff. If you're really, really interested in it, you might want to start looking up more information about GI, and you'll start seeing some of these numbers. So low GI is under 55, and generally speaking, the kinds of foods that you'll be eating with, for example, the rapid fat loss meal template, most of that food is under a GI of 40. Most of the beans are around kind of 25 to 40, thereabouts, and it's good to remember that GI really is only a measurement for foods that have carbohydrates in it, because foods that don't have carbohydrates, generally speaking, don't affect our blood sugar nearly as much. So with GI in mind, we start thinking about, well, is that the same for different people? What about if I eat this particular food with a meal? For example, what if I make a white bread sandwich where I have 2 pieces of white bread, and then let's say I have some chicken and maybe some cheese and some spinach in my sandwich? Is that still a GI of 100, or how does that work? And so then we start talking about what is GL. And so GL is the glycemic load. And that's a more accurate representation of how blood sugar might change in somebody if they eat a certain meal or if they eat a certain food, because it takes into account portion size. So it takes into account how much of something you're eating, and that's a really important thing to bear into mind. What glycemic load still doesn't really tell us, though, is that in a meal situation, for example, where you have these 2 pieces of bread and, some meat and some cheese and some spinach, in actual fact, the presence of the meat, because it's protein, and the presence of the cheese, because there's some protein and some fat as well, and also the spinach, what all of that does is it actually reduces down, effectively, the GI of the bread. And so that's to say, if you ate the bread by itself, it would have a very high GI, but if you have that bread as part of a sandwich with these other things, well, maybe the bread only works out to be kind of having like a medium GI, a moderate GI, around 75, maybe around 80, something like that. And so I realize that this can start sounding a little bit complicated. And so that's why I want to take a quick look now at just how we actually look at a meal and how we actually look at the glycemic load, or just thinking about, what kind of impact does that have on our blood sugar? Because we've already talked in previous modules about the fact that, for example, fiber can help slow down digestion. And that's why the beans and the lentils are so useful for us. And we've also talked about how good fats can actually slow down digestion as well. So both of these things, they actually have a lot to do with GI and GL. And in actual fact, with the rapid fat loss meals that you've been eating, what you've actually been eating are incredibly low GI and really quite low GL meals. And by doing that on a consistent basis, you minimize the insulin that's going around your body, and that means that you can burn your own body fat for energy. So that really is part of what's really working to help you lose fat with the rapid fat loss meals. Now, we can now use this information to actually think about how we might broaden our food choices a little bit, but still keep some of that fat loss rolling in. Or maybe we're at a point where we want to start thinking about maintaining the weight and maintaining the body fat level that we're at. It really depends a lot on what your goals are. Now, of course, some people are going to have goals that are going to take 6 months, maybe even 12 months to achieve. Other people might have goals where 3 months is long enough. So for you, it could be anything in between. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 2 years. It's really not about how quick everyone else is going, or, how slow you're going, or how fast you're going, or anything like that. It's just about making progress towards that goal and knowing that once you achieve your goal, or once you're close to your goal, you're going to know what to do next. So this is all about what you do next. So fiber, fat, and also a thing called resistant starch, they can all help a meal get digested more slowly. And really, all we're doing when we're starting to think about customizing these meals is thinking about what kinds of foods and what kinds of meals digest slowly. So my suggestion is to stick around the same meal times, at least just for now. And the reason I say that is because it works out to be easier in terms of making things a habit and making them a routine. It works out that they're a little more reliable in terms of how much energy you get from them. And it also gives your body some really good periods of time where you don't have insulin running around your bloodstream, which means you've got more opportunities to burn your own body fat for energy. Now, of course, when we talk about burning body fat for energy and all that kind of stuff, what we mean is that we're getting some energy from our own storages as well as from the food that we're eating. And so customizing this lifestyle doesn't necessarily mean eating more food, and it doesn't necessarily mean, eating all of the kinds of foods maybe that you used to eat that actually led to you gaining weight. What this means is that really we don't have to stick with such strict guidelines over the future. But of course, if we ever go back to a lifestyle that caused us to gain a lot of weight, we should really expect that lifestyle, if followed again, will almost definitely cause us to gain weight again. And so really, in terms of customizing this lifestyle, it's all about figuring out what you enjoy eating that's healthy, what you enjoy eating that makes you feel good, that gives you lots of energy, and that contributes to you having a life that you really, really enjoy. Because what I find is that if someone has a life that they really enjoy and a lifestyle that really supports them doing the things that they love to do and seeing the people that they love to spend time with, all those thoughts about kind of eating treats and eating foods that, have amazing flavors every minute of the day, they tend to kind of just disappear. Because all of a sudden there are all these other things in life that are interesting and all these other things in life that really give someone a lot of joy and a lot of variety as well. And we all want variety in our life. So if we think through these meals and we think about GI and GL, basically what we're doing is, we're wanting to create meals depending on which ingredients we select, that's fine. But we really want to think about creating meals that are quite low GI, quite low GL, glycemic load, if you like. So when we're doing that, really, it's a good idea to think through the meals that we have been eating and actually sort of think about them as a bit of a reference point, because that really is the best indicator of how our body in particular, how your body in particular, actually works in terms of carbohydrates, in terms of how much energy it needs, and what it likes and prefers to do with fat storage and fat burning. Now, there's a few other additives that we haven't mentioned already, and they're being used in some different kinds of food products these days to actually lower the GI of certain products. So some that I've come across, for example, is one called guar gum. Now, guar gum has been added to bread lately, in fact, and they're actually producing some breads out there now. You may be able to find them at your local store that are actually rated as low GI. Now, these are very, very specifically produced bread. These aren't a quote-unquote lower GI bread. They aren't a high-fiber bread. Nothing like that. These are actually being produced so that they genuinely can be tested and be found to be under that level of a GI of 55. So if you don't find it, you know what? It might not be, near you just at this minute, but most likely this kind of idea will spread over the next year, next 2 years, and that kind of thing. That's what I expect. Now, another additive that is being used in different kinds of products is an additive called glucomannan. Now, glucomannan actually it's the root of a plant, so it comes from a plant, and it's been used in a certain kind of Japanese noodle for a very long time. It's quite a traditional food in Japan. Now, effectively, all of this plant root, this glucomannan root, is what's called water-soluble fiber. So that means that it's a kind of fiber that can soak up water, and it doesn't get digested because it truly is all fiber. So it can be cooked because it gets produced into a noodle, but it actually doesn't get absorbed at all. So this incredible stuff, this glucomannan, it looks like food. It can sure taste like food depending on how it's cooked, but in actual fact, really almost all of it won't actually get digested, and more likely it'll actually sort of just pass through you. It might ferment a little bit like other kinds of fiber do, but it's not going to hit your blood sugar. And so that really has quite a significant meaning for people who are following a low GI or a low GL diet. Now, the interesting thing about glucomannan is that those noodles are now being sold all across the Western world. So they're definitely available, for example, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and in a lot of other places. And, of course, there are companies who are taking advantage of the mail order business and, online mail order type businesses so that you can actually order these kinds of noodles online. Now, I haven't personally tried any myself, and so for that reason, there isn't a particular brand that I'm going to suggest you check out. I'm not going to make any recommendations about it, but what I do suggest is that, jump on our friend Google and see what you find, because if you do search for glucomannan noodles, I'm sure you're going to find some products that you can try if you're interested. One last additive that's only just been added recently to some foods in certain places is sugarcane fiber. And so that's actually a fiber that's being derived from the sugarcane plant. And although it's coming from a plant that makes pure sugar, it literally is just a fiber that can be used in all kinds of breads and baked goods, because again, it's a water-soluble fiber, so it can help lower the GI of products, but it actually still maintains their texture and their flavor and that kind of thing. So if you start seeing sugarcane fiber on certain products, you'll know why it's being put in there. Now, the last thing to think about with this little section around GI and GL and how we actually can create meals that aren't going to impact our blood sugar in a big way is that through this lifestyle, if you've been able to follow the 4 meals, 4 hours apart schedule, you've had a good 12 hours overnight where you haven't been eating. And what I've found through coaching people is that, as people start modifying and customizing their lifestyle, one of the things that tends to slip is that later evening eating. And as those later evening meals or, even snacks starts to creep into someone's habits, all of a sudden, instead of 12 hours between that last meal of the day and the first meal of the next day, you might only have 10 hours. And then you might only have 8 hours. And then before you know it, if you account for the amount of time it takes for your food to digest, there might only be 4 to 6 hours that you might actually be going without having food processing in your body in one way or another in an entire 24-hour day. Now, that's going to make it a lot more difficult for your body to actually use your own fat for energy, And also might mean that, depending on the kind of food choices you're making, it might make it a lot easier to gain body fat. So it's worth thinking about that and really try and focus on having a good window of 10 to 12 hours overnight where you are basically fasting, because that really is a very natural state for your body. And, eating late night, kind of after dark and just before you go to bed, that's a little less natural for your body. So just think about that overnight fast as being, part of your routine that you definitely want to keep including, even if you change the kind of foods that you've been eating.